Hello everyone. Well, in the first instance, I hope you're all keeping safe and well during these unprecedented times. What I want to do in this section of the playlist is just talk you through what some of the research evidence is showing about distance learning and how we can apply some of this to our thinking about how this can work in school. And the reason why I've started with my face in the corner of the screen here is because we know that one of the things that is important in terms of distance learning, especially for the recipient, the person on the other end, perhaps one of our pupils, is that social contact is very important, and being able to recognise the person on the end of the communication, be that a recording, a voice recording, be that a video capture of their teacher inquiring into their well-being and helping them to understand the tasks that we're setting through distance learning is really important. And also trying to provide opportunities through the digital space for pupils to interact together in a safe and secure environment is also important, which is why we're also promoting quite heavily the use of the hub tools through the Welsh Government platform, because they are the safest and most secure place for our pupils to interact. Okay, one of the first pieces of research evidence that emerged was the Thinking About Pedagogy and Unfolding Pandemic piece of research, which was written on behalf of UNESCO by some leading international researchers. And what this provides is about a 45-page summary of some of the key international evidence. Now, not everyone will have time to read through the full summary, but there are some key pieces of information that I think it was worth flagging. So the executive summary, pages 1 to 2, provides 10 paragraphs which really summarise the key aspects of the research. And then you've also got, towards the end of the document here, the recommendations, pages 34 to 36, and the conclusion that really summarise the report. So, but obviously, if people do want to look at the detail is contained within the body of the document as well. So there are 10 points here in terms of the executive summary, and then if we go to the recommendations, just to pick out highlight a few key recommendations. The first 10 are all for the wider education system, and then the recommendations for schools and teachers for distance learning are captured from number 11 onwards. The first one here, distance learning can involve a combination of both what we're calling synchronous, so that's live, happening in real time, and asynchronous. Those are experiences that have been captured, perhaps filmed, and then made available to young people, where teachers can create experiences for student work at their own pace and make time to absorb content. And one of the key pieces of research around this is we need to be careful around timings because of access issues to digital devices at certain times of the day, potentially if there are a number of children who need to get on and learn, or if there's just one device in the household. So if we make it available asynchronously, so in a space where people can access it when they want, it'll provide them a better opportunity of being able to engage with that learning experience. What we're also saying here in terms of both of these approaches is that we should be utilising the hub toolset, because we know it's the safest and most secure platform in which to have this dialogue around learning. Now, recommendation B here, manage the expectations, give explicit guidelines, publish those guidelines so that parents know exactly what the expectations are, where the work is, how much we're expecting young people to engage with, and making sure that's realistic too. We can't replicate the school day through a distance learning approach. We can't expect the same amount of work to be generated where pupils are trying to study independently, especially if there are limited access to certain resources at certain times, and then give really clear instructions about the length of learning and what we're expecting young people to do. And that links to some of Hattie's research that we'll have a look at in a second. Then obviously there are a number of recommendations here that we could look at. Communicate consistently. All instructions and assignments must be communicated via one source. So if we've got a learning platform, let's use one learning platform. Let's try and construct that in a way that's familiar to the young person so they know how to navigate through and where things are. I know solutions like Google Classroom there, for example, are ways in which we can structure that for them. but make sure that that's consistent as well, particularly for our younger age groups. And in terms of communication, as I mentioned at the start of this clip, it's really important that they hear the voice of the teacher through some of this work where possible, to support them in doing the work. That communication is absolutely key. Then in terms of recommendation here around sending templates or already made checklists for self-regulation, to-do lists and or outcome lists to make planning easier for parents and students. So really make visible what it is that we want young people and their parents to experience through that learning experience, and not simply lists of resources and tasks, but actually really clearly structured, with perhaps more instruction than we would usually provide in the live space. One of the other next sources of evidence here comes from Andy Hargreaves, who, writing the Times Educational Supplement, provided 17 key points for distance learning in the system. Now, all 17 of these are really helpful, and the blog's well worth reading, but I'm just going to highlight a few here. The first one, which is don't send parents or pupils, for that matter, heaps of worksheets. Instead, encourage them to engage with and learn with what they have available at home in terms of their kitchens, their gardens, what access to resources they have. Obviously, one of the things we can't assume is that people are able to print things either, and give them ideas on how to do that and how to engage with that. Rather than trying to simply replicate learning that we might expect to see in the classroom at home. And if we do provide guidance, some work that's structured in that way, then it's really important that it's clear, that pupils are clear how those tasks should be approached, because that will obviously save them a lot of questions that will come back through our online platforms and so on. So that's the first piece of practical advice that Andy suggests here. And very closely linked to that is point 4 around distinguishing between online learning and on-screen learning. So online learning may be continuous on-screen interaction. The example he uses here is a maths game, but it could be setting up activity involving making collages from pasta or models from mud, or doing origami, constructing a robot, or so on. So it could be something that could be completed at home using available materials, and then perhaps the people could upload a photo to demonstrate and show what they've done and share what they've done through the task. So we could use the online platform to set the task up to provide the explanation as to what it is that we want the young people to do, or perhaps some options of things that they could do, so that they can work on it using what's available to them at home. The next point is a really important one. Concentrate teacher resources on time, and time on children who need it most, which is point 7 here. Okay, so making sure that the instructional time, the time taken to understand the task, and what we want our pupils to do in engaging with some of this learning or some of those experiences at home, we think really carefully how that's structured and organised for our most vulnerable learners, and the ones who need the greatest amount of support to engage with it at this time. The next one that I also wanted to highlight here is about staff. And this refers to point 15 on Andy's article, which is keeping up collaborative professionalism, which is the idea that it's really important, especially at this time, that we work collaboratively with our colleagues around planning for our young people's learning. Obviously that can reduce the amount of planning that we do as well, and we can share ideas, maybe collaborate in secondary schools across departments around a particular theme, and we've got a learning model that considers that later on in this playlist. But we really share ideas across the school, and work within those networks. This will also help us, of course, to share strategies that have worked and have been successful. And one thing we're really keen to do at EAS is make sure that where people are having some success with distance learning, and there are good ideas and things that seem to be provoking a really positive response, we're able to share those so that everyone can learn across the region together. The next thing I wanted to consider here was a blog written by John Hattie. John Hattie, obviously, who's looked extensively at the evidence around the impact of particular education interventions and teaching and learning strategies on pupil progress through multiple international studies. And what Hattie does in this blog, which is called Visible Learning Effect Sizes When Schools Are Closed, What Matters and What Does Not, considers how the research he's done in terms of teaching and learning would apply in the current context. And whilst it goes into quite a bit of detail, there are some key things that are mentioned in this article, and I've summarised in this series of bullet points which are on the playlist, which I'll just go through really briefly. The first one: understand what it means to be a learner online. When the usual peer interactions are not present, the teacher's observational skills are different, and there is too often an overemphasis on content and repetition. So I think what Hattie's getting at here is it's really important that we don't overload students with resources, but we give them simple tasks that are clearly explained and that enable them to make progress. The second point really linked to that is share success criteria up front with students before they get too involved in the task. Be clear. And Hattie's really clear here. Teacher clarity matters more when students are not in front of you. So through the tasks also that you're trying to provide to the young people, build in opportunities for them to self-reflect and to do a little bit of formative evaluation of the progress that they're making through the tasks. But above all, make sure things are really clearly structured so pupils know exactly what it is they have to do. That'll obviously also reduce the number of inquiries and questions that you'll get through your learning platform, or however you're communicating around learning to your young people. One of the other things that Hattie talks about is we need to view technology use like planning lessons and creating resources. It means it's the means and the starting point, not the core of teaching. It is decisions we make as students are learning that are important. So not utilising the technology for its own sake, but actually how is that supporting us in thinking about how we're planning these learning experiences for our young people. The next point he makes, or that I've summarised here, we need to find a way to ensure that students at home engage in optimal tasks, not just busy tasks, not just projects to keep them entertained, and not also just boring repetitive activities, things that have a value and a worth and a utility that they can really engage with and get something from. He also says it is the choice of tasks relative to where students are now and where they need to go to next that advances their learning. So the idea here that whatever we provide for them should build on their prior knowledge or experiences or skills that they've developed through time, resisting the temptation to perhaps provide activities that are completely new or introduce a completely new set of skills for which pupils don't have a reference point in their learning. And the last point, which I think is quite an important one, remember, if students get stuck and do not know what to do next or make errors, it's not ideal in terms of depending on parents to know about the errors or what to do next. So try to take ownership for feedback as much as possible. But again, a lot of that would be in terms of how tasks are structured, how they're exemplified, how we're set up in the first place, because that should hopefully reduce errors as pupils engage with some of those tasks. So that's really some of the key points from that article, but it's well worth reading the article in there. It's an interesting read. Okay, so the last piece of evidence I just wanted to really briefly reflect upon was this from the Education Endowment Foundation. It's about working with parents to support children's learning, which obviously is going to be a key aspect to the things we're thinking about in terms of distance learning. There's the full research report that can be downloaded here, and again, that's a very useful document. And then there's a summary of recommendations poster, and which kind of provides a high-level overview of what's contained within the document. And it just is a 4-step process. So the first step being critically review how you work with parents, and I guess particularly around distance learning, this is going to be about the communication strategies we use, about contact, about the routines that we're trying to get into, in terms of the amount of work that we're expecting or experiences we're expecting young people to engage with, how often pupils might be able to expect feedback and things of those nature, which can be set out up front as part of that communication strand. Strand 2 here, providing practical strategy to support learning at home. Again, these haven't been designed specifically with distance learning in mind, but things like the second point here, tips, support and resources can make home learning activities more effective, where they, for example, prompt longer and more frequent conversations during book reading. So clearly a key literacy strategy here to support those skills would be to perhaps provide a task around a particular text or set of texts, where we can help parents to get the best out of that experience for the young person in terms of developing those skills. Number 3, tailor school communications to encourage positive dialogue about learning. And at this time where there is going to be a degree of pressure on families, and a few of these may have applicability in the current circumstances. So, for example, messages are likely to be more effective if they are personalised, linked to learning, and promote positive interactions by celebrating success. So perhaps how can we do that through our current channels that are available through the digital technologies? Communications could be two-way here. Consulting parents, that's very difficult at the moment where all of the learning has moved to a distance learning approach. But are there ways that we can get some feedback around particular activities that parents have enjoyed, or particular experiences that they found rewarding and valuable, or would value more of as part of that ongoing development of distance learning through time? So just some things to consider there, really. And then number 4, offer more sustained and intensive support where needed. And again, this links back, I think, to some of the other research that we've reviewed, which is the importance of sharing expectations and making sure that that's consistent, that they're clear and straightforward to follow through the process. Some of the other initiatives here wouldn't be things that you could necessarily develop through a distance learning approach, but they are things to consider as we move forward with this. So in summary, these are just a few things that we've looked at in terms of formulating our thinking around distance learning. There's quite a lot out there in terms of social media and around. In fact, there's been quite an overwhelming amount of information coming out from different sources around distance learning. But what we've tried to do therefore is summarise briefly on the next couple of slides what distance learning should and shouldn't look like. Just really to help you to formulate your thinking around some of the support you're providing. Hope you found that summary useful.